Today's daf is daf Pei Zayin, but we're in the middle of a Mishnah, so I suggest that we go back to the beginning of the Mishnah on daf Pei Vavam and Beis. Bas Yisrael shenises lekohen tochal b'truma. That's the halach of Kinyan Kaspo, and her husband the Kohen is machil hatruma. Mace, but if he dies, can she continue eating truma? It depends. V'lo himenu ben, if he leaves a son, a Kohen, for her after his death, is tochal b'truma. If, on the other hand, he dies and there's no ben, then she is a bas Yisrael, she cannot eat truma. Nises levi tochal b'maser. And this Mishnah seems to reflect the shita of Rabbi Meir that maser is kodesh, it's not chulin. But at this point, the Mishnah is coming to emphasize that she cannot eat truma, because now that she's married to a Levi, who's like a zar as far as truma is concerned, she cannot eat truma. Mace, once the Levi dies, it depends. And she eat maser, is v'loi menu ben, if he leaves her a son, tochal be maser, just like we saw that a ben is machil his mother truma, so to his mother maser. Nises li Yisrael, so she was once married to a Kohen, he died, she was married to a Levi, and he died, and lo sochal lo b'truma v'lo b'maser. Right, she's a Yisrael, so she cannot eat neither truma nor maser, because her husband, who is a Kohen, is no longer in the picture. Her husband, who's a Levi, is no longer in the picture. And assuming she has no children from either the Kohen or from the Levi, therefore she cannot eat neither truma nor maser. Mace, v'lo heimenu ben, so if Yisrael died and left a son, lo sochal lo b'truma v'lo b'maser. Now, what he's saying here is that even though her husband, who was Yisrael, died, and therefore she should go back to eating truma or maser, we have to figure out which one of the two, but nevertheless, since she has a son from her third husband, the Yisrael, therefore she's possible for truma and maser. Beis b'noah Yisrael. However, now the son of the Yisrael dies, tochal b'maser. She has a son from the Levi, and he's going to be machel hamaser, and that passes her from truma. Mes b'noah mi Levi. Now, if the Levi's out of the picture, meaning the son of the Levi is not machal b'truma, now tochal is not machal maser, then tochal b'truma. Now she goes back to eating truma if she has a son from her first husband, the Kohen. Meis b'noah mi Kohen. So she's a bas Yisrael. She had a son from a Kohen, but he died. Lo sochal lo b'truma v'lo b'maser. Now we begin daf Pei Zayin. Bas Kohen shenises li Yisrael lo sochal truma b'truma. So she's in the reshus of Yisrael by virtue of that marriage, and therefore she loses her ability to eat truma, even though she's a bas Yisrael. She's in the reshus of her husband, who's a zar. Mace, if her husband dies, v'lo heimenu ben, if she has a son from the Yisrael, lo sochal b'truma, because her son now passes up for truma. But if her husband, who's Yisrael, dies without leaving any children, then she goes back to Beis Avia and she eats truma. This is Lil Levi. After her husband, Yisrael, died, she got married to a Levi tochal b'maser. She cannot eat truma because, as we said before, a Levi is a zar as far as truma is concerned. Mace, if the Levi dies, la, hey menu ben tochal b'mas, the ben is machil mas. This is lekohen. After the death of her husband, the Levi, she comes back and marries a Kohen. Tochal b'truma. It means that even though she has children from other marriages who are not Kohanim, they're Zarin, but nevertheless now she's married to a Kohen, she's allowed to eat truma. That's called Kinyan Kaspa. Mace. But what happens after her husband, who's a Kohen, dies? Ve'ahosir love, hey menu ben, he left a ben, is tochal b'truma because the son who's a Kohen is machil his mother truma. Mes b'na mi Kohen. So now her son that she gave birth to from the Kohen, her husband the Kohen, is dead. Once he dies, truma, she cannot eat truma. And the reason for that is because she has children from the Israel, from the Levi, and that passes her for truma. Now, if her son is a Kohen and he's still alive, not this case of Mespina, then she could eat truma. Mespina mi Levi, the son that she had from the Levi dies. Lo sochal b'maser. She cannot eat maser. Why? Because it was the ben that was machil her truma. I'm sorry, maser in this case, and now the ben is gone. Now she still has a ben from the Israel. That's why she cannot eat truma. And the Mishnah emphasizes that she cannot eat maser because the ben that she had from the Levi, who is machil maser, is gone. Mes binam Israel. Not only did the son that she has from Levi die, which excludes her from maser, but the son that she had from Israel dies. So now she has no marriage connections, nor children from anyone who's a non-Kohen. Is then choseres lebeis avia. She's a bas Kohen. She goes back to truma bebeis avia valzo nemar v'shava el beis avia kinu rea v'lechem avia tochel. Now going back to the beginning part of the Mishnah, so we have a segue to the Gemara. In the case of a Bas Yisrael who was married to a Kohen and she has a child from the Kohen, then after the death of her husband, she would eat truma by virtue of the Ben Kohen, but now she gets married to a Levi, to Israel, and she has children from them. So if her son from the Israel dies, umes binah Levi, and so too the son that she had from a Levi dies, tochal b'truma. It means she goes back to Beis Avia. Behadra achla mishum binah. As we said before, this Bas Yisrael, had a ben from the Kohen. And as long as she has a relationship with the Levi, either through the Levi himself or after his death through his ben, which is her ben, then she cannot eat truma. Even though she has a ben who's a Kohen, but she paradoxically cannot eat truma because she's either married to a Levi or she has a son from a Levi. But when her husband, the Levi, and her son from the Levi die, then tochel b'truma, she now goes back to eating truma because again, she had a ben from the Kohen. The Hajj of Yachla Mishum B'nah. And the Gemara is Minayin. And how do we know such a thing? That a Bas Yisrael, even after she got married to a Yisrael, and certainly she was psula, she was excluded from eating truma, she can now go back and eat truma because of her ben who's a Kohen. So the Gemara wants to know, how do we know that a Bas Yisrael, even after he was married to a Yisrael, and she became psula l'truma, she can go back to eating truma because of her son, who's a Kohen, when her husband, who was a Kohen, died. In other words, the Havamina here is that once she left the whole domain of truma by getting married to a Levi and having a child from that Levi, once there was a chalos hafka to remove her from eating truma, she can never go back to eating truma, even though she has a son from a Kohen. So how do we know that she does go back to eating truma? Omar Rabbi Abba, Omar Rav, ubas. There's an extra vav. It says bas ubas. So the pasuk says ubas Kohen kisia almono grusha v'shavel beisavia kinureh milechem avia tochel. Bas ubas. There's a ribui from the extra vav. It could have said bas. And we're going to be marba to include even a Bas Yisrael who can eat truma because of her ben. She becomes psula through nisuin to a Yisrael. So kevan shemeis bailo ha-Yisrael below lahosir zera choseres lechol betruma. So the ribui here is that since she no longer has a connection to the Yisrael, because her husband, the Yisrael, died, and not only that, he didn't leave any zera, she now goes back to Beis Avia. The pasuk says, "V'shavel Beis Avia and milechem Avia tocha," and she can eat truma. So the Gemara asks, "Keman k'Rabbi Akiva Darsh Vavi." We have machlokas elsewhere as to whether we darshan a vav. Rabbi Akiva says we darshan a vav. The Rabbanan say that we don't darshan a vav when the vav is at the beginning of a word in the Torah. And the Gemara says no. Afilu tamer Rabbanan, even though Rabbanan reject vav as a drasha, but nevertheless, when the whole word is superfluous, like in this case, kula ubas who the entire word ubas is a kroyiser. In other words, it could have said in the pasuk, instead of ubas kohen kisi elish zar, it could have said v'chitia almana ugrusha. Why did the Torah have to repeat the words ubas kohen kisi almana ugrusha? It must be a ribui. And that ribui is going to tell me that a Bas Yisrael, even after she was married to Yisrael, but still she has a ben who's a Kohen from her first husband, that's enough to allow her to eat truma. And whether or not you darshan vavin like Rabbi Akiva in the word ubas, or even if you're like the Rabbanan who reject drashas from a vav at the beginning of a word, but if the entire word is superfluous, then even the Rabbana will agree that that there's a ribui from the extra word ubas to teach me that she goes back to eating truma bebeis avia, even though at one point she was disqualified from eating truma because she was married to a Yisrael, but now the Yisrael is out of the picture. He didn't leave her zera, and she can go back to Beis Avia to continue eating truma as she did. Ton Rabbanon, we learned to the Brisa about a Bas Kohen, Kishi Choseres, when she goes back to Beis Avia, Choseres l'truma v'yena Choseres l'chozer v'shok. There are many matnas kahuna, but the one that's on the highest level in terms of kedusha, and it's from a carbon, is a common shlamim, is chazav v'shok. And this woman, if you recall, even though she's a Bas Kohen, but she disqualified herself from truma, because she married a Yisrael, but now the Yisrael dies or divorces. So we had a special din that she goes back to eat truma, as the pasuk says, "V'shavel beis avia." But now the problem is that she wants to eat chaz v'shok, and that's already a higher level of kedusha than truma. And the Brisa paskins that she cannot go back to eat chaz v'shok. And chaz v'shok are parts of the carbon, the basar shlamim, that are given to the kohen. And his wife could also partake in chaz v'shok, but not in this case where she married a Yisrael and became disqualified. We have a special ribui that she's choseres lebeis avia letruma, but not for korbanos. In this case, chaz v'shok. Amar Rav Chizar Ravina bar Shila. Ma'ikra, from whence do we derive this din? And the pasuk says, "Ubas kohen kisiel lizar hi b'trumas hakadoshim lo salkel." And what is trumas hakadoshim? We can interpret it as muram b'muram min hakadoshim, that which is separated from kodesh and given to the kohen. And what is that? That's chaz v'shok. And lo sochel, the pasuk says she cannot eat chaz v'shok, even though she's allowed to eat truma, but not trumas hakadoshim. Rav Nachman Omer Rabba bar Avua, a different source from which we derive the same halacha to exclude her from eating chaz v'shok. It says v'shava el beis avia kinurea milechem avia lo sochel. Is prat lechaz v'shok. So when the pasuk says that she goes back to beis avia, and then it says mi lechem, we're going to darshan the mem of mi lechem, not all lechem, but mi lechem, some of the lechem, and that's truma, but not chaz v'shok. Maskif la Rami bar Chama. If you're telling me that the Torah limited v'shavel beis avia by adding the mem of milechem, then maybe what the Torah is coming to exclude is not chaz v'shok, but ema prat la'faras nedarim. That normally a woman, even though after the death of her husband, she goes back to beis avia as far as achilas truma, that's a bas kohen shenises liyisrael, but nevertheless, she doesn't go back to beis avia, even though she's still a nara, as far as hafaras nedarim. So that's a unique responsibility of the local poskim, the local rabbanim. What does that mean? Well, let's try to understand. A woman was bebeis avia, which means that as a ketana or a nara, her father is in charge of her nedarim, and he's mefer her nedarim. Now she left the rishus of avia, and she married someone, and now this person dies. Does she go back to beis avia for hafaras nedarim? And the answer is, says Rabbi Bar Chama, we're going to derive from the pasuk milechem that once she leaves the rishus of her father by getting married to someone else, she doesn't go back to her father's rishus for hafaras nedarim. Omar Rava says the following. You know what, Rabbi Bar Chama? You don't need a pasuk to exclude hafaras nedarim, that she doesn't go back to her father's rishus, because pasuk tana debei Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel derives in a brisa from Svara that once a girl leaves the rishus of her father, and he can no longer be mefer nedarim, even if she left her rishus of her father, married someone, and that person she married died. Nevertheless, her father could not be made for her nedarim. And again, to emphasize that Tana Bey Rabbi Shmuel derives this from svara, and therefore you don't need a miut of milechem, as Rami Bar Chama was insisting that we do. The Tana Bey Rabbi Shmuel v'neder al mono grusha is kol asher asar al nafshi yakum oleh matalmud lomar. What is the Torah coming to tell me by almonu grusha? Obviously, if she's an almana, her husband is not being made for a nedarim, and even if she's a grusha, obviously her husband can't be made for a nedarim. She's no longer married to her husband. So matalmud lomar, what is the Torah telling me by saying neder almana grusha yakum oleh? Lo mukta michlal av umukta michlal baal. In other words, once the almana is carrying with her a neder, that isur neder is intact. You cannot be made for the nedarim. I mean, there's another thing called chelas chacham, but we're talking about our first nedarim. So who now is going to be made for the nedarim of this almana or grusha? She's no longer in the rishus of her father, and she's no longer in the rishus of the Baal. Either because the Baal divorced her or because he died. So what is this pasuk coming to teach me? Neder almana grusha yakum oleh. I mean, what's the havamina? Who could be made for the nedarim? She's a grusha and almana. She left the rishus of her father. Ella, says Rabbi Yishmael, what's the case? And by the way, again, Rabbi Shmuel, this is the main point for us here, is assuming that once she leaves the rishus of her father, she doesn't go back to the rishus of her. Ella, but what was this pasuk addressing? On the way, after she was given over by her father to shluchim, to get married to the Baal, or alternatively, the Baal sent shluchim, the Ba'av sent shluchim, and then she was passed on from the shluchav to the shluchav Baal, and now, just one second. Yeah. So on the way, when the Masira is being done by the Shluchei Ha'av to the Shluchei Ha'Baal, her husband never died or gave her get, Baderech, on the road, is Hechani Koriba. Rabbi Shmuel kind of asks himself a rhetorical question. Where is she? Is she in Beis Aviyah or is she Beis Baila? Has she left the rishus of her father the very moment that the father sent her with shluchim to be given over to the Baal? So therefore, there's no longer Beis Ha'av as far as this Ketano and Nara is concerned. Oh, Beis Baila. So again, the father took her out of his rishus by giving her over to the shluchim. But yet, the Baal has not received her, so to speak, figuratively. It's just that he sent out the shluchim, and the shluchim received her, but he didn't actually marry her yet. There was no chuppah v'kedushin, and then he dies. So therefore, the Gemara thinks at this, Rabbi Yishmael thinks at this point, she's neither here nor there. She's in like the twilight zone. She's not Beis Aviyah. She's not Beis Baila. this pasuk that we started with, Neder al Monu Grush al etc. Yakum Aleh, is coming to teach me that Kevan Sheyotza Sha'achas Mitzvah Shuveni Yochel Lahafeh. Once the father gives her over to the Shluchei Abal, he no longer has rights to be made for her Nedarim. So we already learned from this brisa that you don't need a mute in the pasuk of Milechem v'lo kol lechem with regard to Hafaras Nedarim. It's Pasha Misvara. She's already left the Rishus of the Av. Therefore, we're going to say that Milechem comes to teach me that Eina Choseres leChazav V'Shok. Rav Safar Omar, he has a different drush of V'Shovel Beis Aviyah Kanel Milechem Aviyah Tochel. He's going to dash him from the word Lechem. Forget about the mem. Lechem v'lo basar. So she's V'Shovel Beis Aviyah as far as eating Lechem is concerned. And that's Truma. Rav Papa Amar, he has an alternative derivation. Lechem aviyah tochel. Lechem akonu le'aviyah. It says lechem aviyah means he owns that lechem. And here Rav Papa makes a lumdish fundamental distinction between Truma on the one hand and Chazav V'Shok on the other hand. Truma belongs to the Kohen. And therefore it is described as Lechem Aviyah, Lechem Akoni Laviyah, but Chazav V'Shok is not considered the mammon and the bilus of the Kohen that receives the Chazav V'Shok to be Shulchan Gavoa Kazach. So the basar of Karbonos and what's ever left that's given to the Kohen as Matnas Kahuna, it's Mishiore Shulchan Shel Melech. He's being zochet from the Shulchan Shel Melech. So therefore, it's not called Lechem Aviyah. It's not Mamono Shel Kohen. But in Truma, the Torah says that you give Truma to the Kohen, and the Kohen makes a kinyan. It's his personal possession. Rav Amar, another possible derivation that Eina Choseres leChazav V'Shok. It says in the parasha of Chazav V'Shok, Beis Chazei Hashtnufa Ve'Shok HaTruma Tochlu B'Mokom Tor Ata Uvanecha V'Nosecha Itoch. And there's an extra word Itoch. Says Rava, what do I derive from the extra word Itoch? That Bisman She'itach, meaning before she gets married to Yisrael, then she could eat Chazav V'Shok. But after she leaves her father's Rishus and she gets married to Yisrael, she can never, ever, forevermore eat Chazav V'Shok. Omar Rav Ado Bar Ava Tana, we learned in a brisa about Kohen Shicho Zeres Lebeis Aviyah. If her husband dies and leaves no zera, Ozeres L'Truma V'Yein Ozeres L'Chazav V'Shok. Although that's true, that after her husband dies, she does not go back, return to Beis Aviyah. I'm sorry, she does go back and return to Beis Aviyah, not only as far as true, but even as far as Chazav V'Shok, Bishvil Binah. So again, if she has no son from her husband, then her Chazara is absolutely complete. This is really fascinating. On the one hand, she's a Bas Kohen. But on the other hand, she was married to Yisrael. Now her husband Yisrael dies and leaves no zera. She goes back to Beis Aviyah to eat truma as she originally did. In such a case, she does not get chaz v'shok, as we saw from all the different yalfusas. But on the other hand, if a Bas Yisrael was married to a Kohen and her husband died, and he left a son who's a Kohen, even if afterwards she gets married to Yisrael, which passes her from Truma, once that Baal dies, Choseres, she goes back to Beis Avia. She goes back to eating Truma because her son, the Kohen, is Machel Truma. And now Rav Ad is saying that son who's Machel at Truma can be Machel her Chaz v'Shok as well. Also, Rav Mordechai Omer l'Shmaita Kamid Rav Ashi, when he quoted this brisa in front of Rav Ashi, Omer Rav Ashi responded that this brisa is difficult. A Bas Yisrael could eat because of her son, and therefore she's choseres lechol b'chaz v'shok mehecha k'misraba mi ubas. Where's your ribui for this? Mi adifa lo mine. When the pasuk says ubas Kohen, and we darshan either from the extra word or the extra vav, that if she has a ben from a Kohen, she can eat truma, is a mi'adifa lemina. How is she superior to a Bas Kohen herself, who does not go back to eat chaz v'shok? The Gemara says, Hasam ksiva miuta. We have a miuta to teach me that she does not go back to chaz v'shok. But hacha, in the case of her ability to eat because of her son, lo ksiva miuta, we have no drasha to be memaida from achilas chaz v'shok. And therefore, she can go back to eat chaz v'shok. Mishnah says, Bas Kohen shenisis Yisrael. Meis bina mi Yisrael choseres lebeis avia v'chels truma kan rabbanan v'shavel beis avia kinurea prat l'shomeres yavam. So it's Bas Yisrael, Bas Kohen, who was married to Yisrael, he dies without children, and you would think that therefore she goes back to beis avia to eat truma. No. The deceased husband left a live brother, and therefore she's kuka liyiba. She cannot go back to truma because she's still connected to her husband Yisrael, not to her husband per se, but through zika to her husband's brother. So that zikas yibum is a kind of an ishus relationship to a non-Kohen, and that excludes them from eating truma. And then we darshan ginurea prat lemuberes. If her non-Kohen husband died after she became pregnant, she cannot eat truma. We're going to have a whole sugi now as to whether or not we really need a pasuk for this, but let's just get the halach itself. She has a Baal Zar, he died, but he left her pregnant. And therefore, she cannot be choseres lebeis avia. So now the Gemara asks, why do you need this pasuk? To exclude the case of Bas Kohen, who became pregnant from Yisrael, to exclude her from eating truma lo dinu. It can be derived from the logic, the compelling kal v'chomer. Uma b'yevama, b'yibum. Shu makom shelo asa vlad ben arishon kevlad ben hasheni lefotcha min hayibum. She had a vlad from one husband. Now she's married to a second husband who dies without children. We don't say that the original vlad that she has from one husband now is going to pater up from Yibum for another husband. And yet also Ubar Kilud. So again, even though Vlad ben Arishan is not considered Vlad ben Hasheni, but yet a pregnancy, a fetus, is considered as if it was already born, which means that if her husband, her first husband, when he died, he left her pregnant, she's not Skuka L'Yibum. And this is derived in a Gemara back on Daf Lamed Daled Amud Beis from the pasuk Uben Elo Ayin Olam. It's Mokom Cha'asa Vlad ben Arisha Kevlad ben Hasheni Leposla min Atruma Eno Dincha Nasa Ubar Kilud. In a case where the Torah says that the Vlad Rishon is considered like the Vlad Sheni, which means that if a Bas Yisrael was married to a Zar, that passes off a Truma, and now she marries a second husband without any children, who dies without any children. She does not go back to Beis Avia. So that's called Vlad min Arishon. So the Vlad min Arishon is going to have an impact on her even after she has a Vlad min Hasheni. I'm sorry, even after she marries a second husband. And what are we talking about? A Bas Cohen. And she was married. And she has a Vlad min Arishon. And now the second husband, who was Yisrael, is gone. So you would think that now she can eat Truma because Choseres L'Beis Avia, she's a Bas Cohen. But we're going to say, no, she can't do so because she has a Vlad from Baila Harishon. Is Eno Din, how much more so with regard to Truma? Ishanasa Ubar Kilud. That if her Zar husband left her pregnant, certainly she's puzzled from Achilas Truma. So again, why do we need a pasuk to darshan this from Kinurel? Bar says lo. Mali asa uber kilud yibum. I have a pirch on your kalvachomer in the case of uber kilud, that if the deceased brother left her pregnant, she doesn't fall for yibum. Sharei asa mesim kechayim. Where do we see in Yibum that Mesim Osakasu Mesim Kechayim? If after her husband dies, leaving her a son, if that son dies, there's no nefila for Yibum because Mesim Kechayim. It's as if the Yilud is still alive, and therefore Nasa Uber Kilud. Therefore, the case of Yibum, we consider an ubar to be a lud, because if we have halacha of mesim kechayim, then we should have halacha of ubar ki lud. And notice in both cases, she's excluded from yibum. Either she's excluded for yibum because at the time of the death of her husband, she had a son from him, or at the time of the death of her husband, she was pregnant with an ubar. But in the case of Linyan Truma Shalo also Mesim Kechayim, which means that if her husband dies, he's a Zar, she has a son from him, and then later on he dies, Choseres L'Beis Avia Lechol Truma. There's no, like in Yibum, that critical moment at the time of his Misa, and he left her a son. Here, with regard to Truma, if a husband who's a Zar dies, she's a Baskoy, and she has a son from him. Later on, that son dies. She's Choseres the Beis Avia. She goes back to eat Truma. Lo asaba Mesim Kechayim. It's therefore Talmud Lomar Kinureo Prat Lemuberes. That if a Baskoy was married to a Zar and he left her pregnant, she doesn't eat Truma. Now, I would assume, I don't have a clear-cut proof for this, that if that Vlad turns out to be an Eno Ben Kayoma, like a Nefel, then I would assume it's no different than a woman who's a Baskoin who was married to a Zar, had a child, the child died later, that she can go back with the death of her husband, so she goes back to Beis Avia. Itzrich lemichte mevuberes, the itzrich lemichte v'zera ein la. I need both psukim to prohibit her from eating truma. I need the pasuk v'zera ein la to teach me that if she has a live son from her husband Azar, she doesn't eat truma. And I need also the halach of kinurea to exclude muberes if she was married to a Zar and he left her pregnant. Now, offhand, I have to tell you, this is mind-boggling. I mean, if she was left by her husband a Zar with a fetus in her belly, and she cannot eat truma, how much more so if she has zera from the Baal? I mean, this is like this Gemara we're about to learn. Again, half of it I understand. The other half is as wild as it can get. Because Rachman of zera ein la, we would not exclude a muberes. Okay, that I understand. Because muberes is not yet zera yeshla. It's not zera yeshla. She's only muberes. Mekarachad gufa v'ashta trei gufa. When she was Beis Avia, she was only one guf. Now she has two gufim. She has a vlad from a Yisrael. Havel muberes to be karachad gufa ashtel yachad gufa. Again, it's very fancy dramatic language, but the bottom line is that in the case of muberes, she doesn't even have a son. Is Ema Techal, I would have a havmin to say that she can eat. She goes back to Beis Avia to eat truma. Tzricha. Okay, so that I understand. We need a chiddush of muberes. But now the other way around. Eat kosher rachmanu muberes. Then l'chora kal v'chomer that if she has children from the live, full, mature children from her Baal who's a Sarah, certainly she's excluded from Truma. Gemara says no. Muberes is the Meikara Gufa Srika, Bahasha Gufa Malia.